Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
For weeks, tens of thousands of Georgians have taken to the streets in the capital, Tbilisi, and other major cities. They're protesting their government's attempts to pass a so-called foreign agents law. Opponents of the law say it's modeled after a similar law passed in 2012 in Russia, which the Kremlin has subsequently used to destroy civil society and independent media. But why is Georgia, a NATO and EU candidate country, trying to pass this law, which is certain to damage its chances of Western integration? To answer this question, I'm joined today on Chain Reaction by Ambassador Ian Kelly. Ian Kelly is ambassador retired in residence at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. He's a retired senior foreign service officer who last served as the U.S. ambassador to Georgia from 2015 to 2018. He previously served as the U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe from 2010 to 2013. Prior to his ambassadorships, Kelly held a variety of high-level roles at the U.S. State Department, including serving as the department's spokesman under Secretary Hillary Clinton and as director of the Office of Russian Affairs. Before joining the State Department, he earned a PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from Columbia University. Ambassador Kelly, thank you for joining me on Chain Reaction today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So we're here to talk about Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. For several weeks, tens of thousands of Georgians have taken to the streets nightly to protest their government's intention to pass a so-called foreign agents law. The protesters and Georgia's Western partners likened the bill to a Russian law passed in 2012, which the Kremlin has since used to gut independent media and destroy the NGO sector in Russia. Why is the Georgian government trying to pass this law now?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I mean, that really is, I think, the most important question to ask right now. But I think you have to look back over the last few years where you've seen a series of events and legislative actions that take Georgia off the path towards integration with the EU and with NATO and closer to the illiberal regimes, both in Moscow and in Budapest. And I think that this so-called foreign agents law is probably the most objectionable in terms of trusting Georgia to do the right things to join the Western community of democracies. We've seen a number of these actions that really almost kind of imitate what's happened in Russia since 2000 when Putin became president. We've seen the government cancel projects starting in 2019 that would have benefited the Caucasus region in terms of improving or enhancing a southern corridor for trade and information. One was a deep water port in Anaklia, and another was a digital fiber optic cable running from Azerbaijan to Georgia that would have taken a lot of the information space from Russia. So you have east-west corridors rather than north-south. Those moves were suspicious. They seemed to benefit only one country, really. It benefited Russia. And then these moves away from the West really got catalyzed by, after the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. There was the expectation that a country that had aspirations to join the EU and join NATO would make common cause with at least with its fellow aspirants, with Ukraine and Moldova, or even go further and match some of the sanctions that the European Union has imposed. But they haven't. In fact, they have done a lot of very hostile actions, used a lot of hostile rhetoric towards Ukraine, to the point where the Zelensky government recalled their ambassador. I mean, I'm not going to go through all the various things they did, but I think probably the most egregious thing that was said was blaming NATO for the invasion of Ukraine. That was last year, I believe, and it was right before the NATO summit. And breaking with tradition, neither the Georgian prime minister nor the Georgian president went to the NATO summit. So these were all clear signals that Georgia is really putting a lot of room between itself and the West, and is moving closer to Russia. This foreign agents law is the most worrisome law that they've passed. They've also passed other illiberal laws that were anti-LGBTQ. Similar laws about forbidding propaganda of the gay lifestyle, as Russia has done. But this one is a real weapon. This was the kind of law that Russia passed in 2012 that signaled the gradual dismantlement of civil society in Russia, and triggered a lot of arrests. It forced a lot of people to leave Russia, to set up offshore media because they couldn't broadcast in Russia. And I think the reaction of the West has been even more intense because of the falsehoods that senior Georgian Dream officials have been spreading about this law, claiming that it's like the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the United States. It's not. The Foreign Agents Registration Act is to get people who are actually acting as agents for a government, and are based in the United States and are not used against NGOs, universities, and others who are funded by our friends. The EU gives a lot of money to universities, funds chairs, things like that, and we don't ask them to register with the Department of Justice. So it's obviously targeted. One against the West, first against the West, and then against the civil society. Why now? Yeah, one has to ask oneself why now, and why they're so persistent in pushing this despite very alarming and even dangerous unrest that it's provoking on the streets. Yeah, one has to question oneself, why now? It may have something to do with the election coming up. To guarantee a free and fair election, of course, you need a lot of eyes on the election, and it's civil society that provides those eyes. And if they're all marginalized or demonized, they're not going to be able to do their job. Yeah, it really is, I think, a real kind of a hinge moment, I think, in the West's relations with Georgia.
Yeah, and so the why now question I asked first because I wondered, as you know, they tried this last year, early spring of 2023. They introduced a very similar law. They literally only changed a few words in it, and they withdrew it because of massive civil society protests. I think the elections must have something to do with it. They know that elections coming in October, Georgian Dream popularity has been sliding. The attacks have been especially vociferous against groups like Transparency International Georgia, the International Society for Free Elections and Democracy, all these international observer organizations. And you mentioned the rhetoric. So the rhetoric has gotten even more volatile and even more aggressive. The latest, when now honorary chair of Georgian Dream, Bidzina Ivanishvili, his speech on the 29th of April, when the Georgian Dream government sort of had a organized counter protest to all these spontaneous civil society protests, had a really strange way of sort of knitting together the West Ukraine and the former government into this thing they call the global party of war, right? And you mentioned this Georgian government's response to the invasion of Ukraine, which caught so many people off guard. I was in Georgia serving there in the embassy when the war started, and everyone was sort of shocked that the response was as negative as it was. And I wonder if everything is so personalized in Georgian politics that if the fact that several officials from the former government landed in Ukraine and were working in the Ukrainian government is one of the reasons why this government has been so vehemently anti-Ukraine, even after it was invaded by Russia.
Yeah, I mean they have obviously a real a paranoia about the previous government. I mean, the previous government, they've been in power for 12 years. So it's not like they're talking about something that happened recently, but it's kind of a sort of a convenient message, and the message is you got to stick with us, or you're going to have to return to the bloody dictatorship, as Ivanishvili called it, which is a complete false binary there. That's not what the Georgian people are going to be choosing in October. So a big part of it is it's borrowing from other illiberal regimes. I think most prominently from Orban's Hungary. It sets up this kind of dire choice. We do it here in the United States too, and we've been particularly doing it the last few elections, where you absolutely demonize the other candidate and the other party. I think what's disturbing here is where in Hungary you have a tradition, not a very long one maybe, but a tradition of democratic institutions. You certainly have a long history of democratic institutions and interlocking checks and balances in the United States that really does hold the executive accountable. You don't have it in Georgia. Well, actually, you do have it, but the last remaining sector is exactly the sector which is the target of this new law. It's the civil society and independent media. Georgian Dream already controls the judiciary, already controls the legislature, obviously, and now they're going after this last bastion, independence, and last check on their power.
The civil society, right?
The civil society and
Western
the opposition,
civil society,
and the independent media. If they continue down this road, I mean, it does seem like they want a Russian-style law. We know what happens, particularly if they win the election in October. But Ivanishvili is not even hiding that he's going to use this as a tool of oppression. He said, we are going to make the opposition, the UNM movement or whatever, which is the whole opposition. He calls all the opposition the radical opposition.
Everybody's radical, yeah.
Right. So he's saying, we're going to go after you with this law. And it's just very disturbing, and it is definitely a red light flashing for anybody who wants to support the majority of Georgians who want to have a free, democratic, and prosperous society.
Right, and the polls have been clear across decades, right? There's regular public opinion polling done in Georgia about support for NATO and EU membership, and it's always mid-60s to mid-80s, and sometimes higher, of Georgians across several decades have said, yes, we feel like we belong in NATO and the EU. We're willing to work and do what it takes to get there. So you were the U.S. ambassador in Georgia from 2015 to 2018, also a time, as you noted, when the ruling Georgian Dream Party was in power. So what major differences do you see between your time there then and what we're seeing now? And has there been an inflection? Can you name an inflection point, or has this been sort of a gradual deterioration or a slide into what we see now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've actually been reflecting on this a lot. I had, just to put all my cards on the table here, I had fairly frequent meetings with Bidzina Ivanishvili. We would have lunch or dinner every few months, usually with our spouses. And he was a great interlocutor for me. And if I had some concerns, and I did have a concern about some of the legal actions being undertaken, especially with the leading opposition television station at the time, Rustavi 2, it's changed editorial policy now. I would have a line into Bedzina. I could call him, I could text him. But the big difference between the government of 2015, 2016, and the government now is that the Georgian Dream went into government as a coalition. So the majority of the cabinet and the majority of the seats within the coalition were Georgian Dream. But you had ministers who were representatives of different parties. You had a Speaker of Parliament who was a representative of a different party. You had the Free Democrats in the cabinet with Irakli Alasanya, and then Tina Hidasheli as Minister of Defense, and then you had David Usupashvili, who was Speaker. So you had a coalition government there. I saw warning signs in October of 2016, when Georgian Dream went into the parliamentary elections without these parties and pushed out Hidasheli and Usupashvili. And so that was when things started to go a little too unitarian when it came to the judiciary in particular. I was very fortunate to have a counterpart in government, the prime minister and the foreign minister, and the defense minister for that matter too, were really kind of governed by consensus. They were not trying to push certain initiatives through Parliament. In whole areas of the government, the prime minister, Georgi Kvidikashvili, especially when it came to the economy and foreign relations, had a very pro-Western attitude. We were able to start a train and equip program, which you probably know about. The Georgia Defense Readiness Program started in 2016, I think, under Kvidikashvili. It ended in 2021. Both that and, of course, the Marine training program, to deploy jointly with Georgia into Afghanistan. So those were really kind of high watermarks in many ways. I was a little concerned when Trump came in, but actually Trump leaned forward in helping Georgia. President Obama didn't want to give Ukraine and Georgia lethal weapons. Trump was able to provide that. So, yeah, I mean, 2016, 2017 really were high marks in the recent history, anyway, of U.S.-Georgian relations.
One of those years, I happened to be in Tbilisi for the Georgian Defense and Security Conference, was the year that I think it was a platoon or a company of U.S. strikers did a road march all the way from Poti to down to here to Freedom Square in Tbilisi.
Right. I remember it well.
More M1 tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles on Freedom Square.
It was fabulous. Yeah.
And that was when the mission in Afghanistan was still happening. And so under this government, there have been high points, very high points in the bilateral relationship, both, I think, diplomatic, as you can attest to, and in the security realm as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. We had the Millennium Challenge program supporting the growth of STEM education during those years, too. So we had a number of programs that either ended naturally or were allowed to fizzle away. So there's no more Marine training because there's no more deployments in Afghanistan, obviously. The GDRP program just ended. It wasn't renewed. I don't know why. And the MCC program ended, and there was no renewal of that too. So you had these kind of hallmark programs that both were representative of our growing cooperation, and also really did show that we were working together to build a better Georgia. And then Kvidikashvili was forced out. And also, you started to see some real threats from Russia about the growing presence of NATO. It didn't get much play in the United States or in the West in general, but a deputy foreign minister in public said Georgia has to choose between having a peaceful region or joining the EU and NATO. Is that the way he put it? But basically, he said you've got a binary choice, either us or them. And he basically said if you choose them, if you choose NATO, things will get really complicated for you.
This is a Russian deputy foreign minister, right?
Right, Grigori Karasin.
Yeah, Karasin. Yeah. I remember that statement.
That was a real gauntlet put down. And interestingly enough, months later, you had the cancellation of those two projects, Anaklia and the Silk Road, fiber optic cable, were both canceled in that year. And you had the invitation of Sergei Gavrilov, who is a Russian Duma deputy, who was invited to address, to give a speech in the Georgian parliament from the speaker's podium. That led to all kinds of unrest as well. And the Russians showed their displeasure by canceling all flights to Georgia, which hurt, economically.
Yeah, I do remember Gavrilov night was June of 2019. I remember it well. And my sense is that was sort of an inflection point for Georgian Dream. That's when they started to sort of equate sort of the civil society, the quote unquote radical opposition, and Western meddling or whatever.
Although it had nothing to do with Western meddling.
Of course not. No.
The Gavrilov night.
But this is the whole color revolution narrative, right? That the Russians propagate and push.
Yeah.
That all of these, the rose, orange, tulip, Maidan revolutions are not popular uprisings that overthrow corrupt authoritarian regimes. They're coups sponsored by the Western intelligence services that overthrow pro-Russian governments, right? So,
right. And don't forget that Georgia has accused USAID of funding attempts at a color twice. I forget, what they were in particular. And that was mentioned, recently by the Prime Minister, Kobakidze, mentioned that the U.S., helped these, these two foiled color revolutions. I mean, that is a slander. To accuse the United States of financing an extrajudicial coup, is just out and out. It's a lie and it's slander.
I remember at least the latest time was last fall, I think, sometime around late September, early October, that story resurfaced again. The USAID plotting a coup story. But the answer to this question is probably self-evident, but I guess I should ask it anyway. If this law passes, Georgia is officially a candidate for both NATO and EU membership. What would the effect of the passage of this law be on Georgia's candidacy for those organizations?
It would be a disaster. And I was taught never to speculate when I was a foreign service officer. So I would say I can't answer that because that's a hypothetical. Mm-hmm. However, I feel fairly confident it's going to have a real negative impact on EU accession talks. There was I read today that there were like 30 members of European Parliament who called for the Georgia's not accession talks, but calling for their application to be suspended, even now before the law is passed. After the law is passed, there'll be a lot of consultation between Washington and Brussels, but the ball will really be in the EU court. NATO membership is a much more distant prospect. EU accession, kind of ironically, finally seems to be on the horizon with these fast tracks because of the war in Ukraine. I'm sure it's infuriated a lot of Georgians that just at this time, when Georgia seems to have a good prospect, not only for membership, but an accelerated membership. And what does the government do? Throws a monkey in the works. this seems to be the desired outcome, that they get suspended, that the EU turns them down. It would be just a crying shame given the historical aspirations of the Georgian people to become a part of Europe.
I guess when 80+% of your population supports EU membership, it's much easier to go to your population and say the EU rejected us, not we rejected the EU.
Right, right.
So
Well, you saw that Bidzina Ivanishvili in that famous speech that he gave in that counter demonstration, and he said, "We will join the EU." He said, "We are still on the path, despite all this evidence to the contrary." So yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that's what they want. They want the EU to turn them down. They say, "Well, what could we do?" They turned us down, and then they can continue setting up an Orban-like or a Putin-esque one-party government.
Yeah. Well, so we, the U.S., have been consistent supporters of Georgia's NATO membership, and although, as you mentioned, we're not in the EU, we've been provided support rhetorically, at least, to Georgia's EU candidacy. And Georgia has long been one of the largest per capita recipients of U.S. aid in the region. Why is that? Why does Georgia matter to us, to the United States?
Well, I think it matters for a political reason, and I think it matters also for a kind of an international security reason. Unfortunately, that latter is less operational. The Georgian Defense Ministry, as you know, has really good relations with the Pentagon because of its participation in U.S. operations and in NATO operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So I mean that was a major reason why we were supporting Georgia with all of this security assistance to make them interoperational with us. It was in our interest that they operated with us. As I say, it's sort of less important now because the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan have gone away. But there's kind of a political military reason to support Georgia. We don't want Russia to succeed in making Georgia a satellite again. So that's why the U.S. taxpayer has funded the Georgia Defense Readiness Program, which is kind of a train and equip program for Georgia to deter Russia. That's important. It has also been important as a kind of what the State Department like to call the Southern Corridor. So it's kind of the endpoint for the Southern Corridor to get Caspian energy out to the West without going through Russia. And unfortunately, that's kind of becoming less and less important as well, especially the oil part of it. But then there's just the plain political argument that in order for the Eurasian region to succeed, we have to promote and support those countries that are trying to become pluralistic democratic states, become a kind of a virtuous counter model to the Russian system of governance. One of the messages that Putin pushes out is that the West doesn't want you, and B, we are fundamentally different. We Orthodox, we Eurasians, we don't want the Western model. We don't want all this tolerance and gay rights and everything that comes with it. So that's part of the battle here too. But in all these regards, unfortunately, these various points here, political, military, security, and just plain old defense, they're all less important, unfortunately, because the United States has bigger fish to fry. There are more dramatic events going on. I mean, that's one of the things I think that Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream were counting on, that the U.S. just wouldn't care because we've got more important things going on. I think that they've been a bit surprised by, not so much by the Western reaction, but by the reaction of the Georgian people. And it's why, I think it's so important that we show solidarity with those who are giving up their bodies in many cases to continue on a Western path.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating for me to watch these protests as they've gone on pretty much nightly for 3 weeks, and the spontaneity with which they're organized. And, I'm following dozens of accounts on Twitter, X, and now there are Facebook groups and everything. This is springing up spontaneously, which sort of undermines the whole color revolution narrative, right? The idea that this is some sort of Western intelligence service inspired plot or coup, because these are clearly Gen Z and younger millennials who are social in digital media and digital natives doing what they do, which is spontaneously organizing, contesting the government's authoritarian turn with a lot of courage and a lot of persistence. These have gone on, we're, like I said, a little over 3 weeks. Something you said a minute ago maybe sort of segues into my last question, I guess, and that is, have we been slow to recognize what's happening in Georgia? You said Ivanishvili and his crew sort of hoped they could fly under the radar, but you noted it when you were talking about your time as ambassador there. You started to see some warning signs and sort of the moving people out of the coalition government and making it more strictly Georgian Dream. Gavrilov Night was a warning sign. Have we missed what's happening in Georgia? Have we been slow to recognize it? And if so, why do you think that is?
I mean, simple answer is yes. We have been slow to recognize it. And yeah, it is just, I know from working in the State Department, it is just so hard to get the attention of people on the 7th floor, as we used to say, all the secretary and all the undersecretaries. It's just really, really tough. And when you can't point to one situation that would, lead to real negative consequences for U.S. security, as you could, when they were with us in Iraq, or, they were with us in Afghanistan, it's hard to get their attention. I mean, sure, supporting democracy is important, and supporting people who are advocating for their freedom is important, but it's not going to get the kind of peer-to-peer attention that you need. So you're not going to get the secretary to call Tbilisi. It's going to get kicked down. It's going to get kicked down to a less senior person who's not going to have the impact of Hillary Clinton picking up the phone, or George Bush picking up the phone. George W. Bush. He's the only American president to come to Georgia. We are trying to, run relations all around the globe. And of course, it's the terrible metaphor, but it's the squeaky wheel that gets all the attention. It's tough. And I have been pretty vocal about backing rhetoric with actions, imposing costs. Don't just jaw and say we're deeply concerned. Make these actions have consequences. And you can calibrate it. You start off with relatively easy and minor costs, like you can't come to our country. We're putting a visa ban on you, and you can move it up as the situation gets worse. But I think that the Georgian Dream government has calculated that they don't stand to lose much by pushing the West away. I don't think they think we're capable of really imposing costs, and they actually see some downsides to joining the West, because of all the hectoring they get, all the visits they will get, the Venice Commission reports that they'll get, when their real goal is to gather all the reins of power and stay in government.
Yeah, so in that sense, the transparency that's required to be part of these Western clubs is unwelcome.
Right, exactly.
Inconvenient.
That's why I talk about sovereignty. That's the big word now, is sovereignty.
Yeah,
you have no right. You have no right to look into our books, or you have no right to tell us we have to stop this law. This is we are representing the Georgian people. We will do what's right for them. You don't have a say in this because this is a sovereign country.
I say all the time, nobody has ever been dragged kicking and screaming into NATO and the EU, right? Not only does a country have to apply and want to be in these organizations, but it's really tough to get in.
Yeah.
So if Georgia decides it doesn't want to be in, no one's going to make it join either. But I don't think, I think that some Georgians, at least in government, believe that they can continue to get the amount of Western aid that they've been getting and assistance while sort of holding the EU and NATO at arm's length because they don't want to comply with the rules.
Right.
And I wonder, and there's not a lot of evidence that they're wrong so far because we're at least 5 years into this sort of authoritarian turn, the degradation of Georgian democracy, but the aid, the assistance continues to come almost on a path dependent, like, yeah, we did it last year, we'll do the same thing plus 10% this year.
Absolutely.
So there's, they may be smarter than, no one said they aren't smart, but they may be smarter than we are, or smarter than we think. I don't know. I guess time will tell, but well, thank you so much, Ambassador Kelly, for your time. I know you're watching Georgia every day and every night like I am, and hoping for the best and hoping that, democracy and civil society win out over what can only be described as an authoritarian, illiberal turn.
Absolutely. Fingers crossed. Thank you very much, Bob. I really appreciated it.
Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.